Welcome to everybody who's joined. My name is Andrew Farah. I'm the founder and CEO, co-founder and CEO of Density. I have Emre Sonmez who runs product. And today we thought that we would do some live demos of some of the stuff that we've been building with Atlas. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and maybe just tee this up for a second. I want to just a couple of housekeeping items. We're going to run probably past the 30 minutes, but I would just say you're obviously welcome to drop off whenever. We're going to try to cover the bulk of things in the first half hour. If you have questions, don't hesitate to add them to the Q&A. I have both chat and Q&A open, and I'm going to work them into some of what we're discussing and showing you all. And nothing's off limits, so feel free to ask whatever you're curious about. And we're going to spend most of the time actually demoing as opposed to just sort of showing slides, although there's some cool slides too. So, okay, it is a very strange time in buildings. It's also a very strange time in organizations who are trying to figure out how to become, financially fit or really careful about how they spend. And obviously real estate is a really large line item. And I think some of the things that we have heard from many of the customers that we talk to is that there are two really important parts of building strategy right now. The first is efficiency, where are we spending dollars or time, resources on the space that we don't use. That's sort of like blocking and tackling consolidation and return on investment on underutilized space. And then the second is what we call critical mass, or we're calling critical mass. A lot of folks talk about return to office, but when people come back to physical buildings, the question I think that is on everybody's mind is like, how do you create a critical mass of people on a floor or in a space that then keeps people wanting to be with their teams? And I would say our perspective is that work should and can happen in lots of different space types, and home is one of them. But as technologists that build stuff that can measure how humans use buildings, and specifically workplaces or offices, we have noticed some pretty fascinating data in return to office and in how people are using and not using space. So if it's all right, Emre, maybe I could tee you up to show some stuff, and then I can talk about some of the specific data that you'll be looking at.
Cool. Awesome. So we can dive in. We wanted to show you all data, kind of live data that's anonymized, but actually like real data across different space types, tying to these questions of how are people returning to office, and then how efficient are different spaces, or where is there critical mass versus where there isn't. So I'll go ahead and pull this up.
So a couple of things. You're looking at a floor plan, and before you bounce around, Emre, because everything will change, I want to call out a couple of things. Like one, this is a part of the Atlas platform. So this is like an application that lives inside of Atlas. Atlas is what we describe as the platform that customers get when they're using our systems to measure how space performs. So that's everything from the hardware all the way through to the software. You're looking at a floor. This happens to be a floor plan with a bunch of different spaces. Each of the different colored spaces are areas of interest, rooms or open spaces, a bunch of different space types. And what we're going to show is we think utilization as a concept is sort of broken and a little bit arbitrary. What you'll notice in the top left is a metric called time used. And if you could just click that arrow for me, Emre. We use the term density for this. It's possible we end up with a better term for this, but we've realized that utilization is like two things. The first component is like, is a space in use? And then the second component is how many people are in the space when it's in use. So if you have a 500 square foot space and you have two people in it, then your density is essentially 250. So it's like sort of square feet per person when in use. And the value of that is like, if you select density instead of time used, you'll see the values change on the exact same space. So this floor plan essentially has time used, if you can go back to time used, a whole bunch of spaces that are actually in use, but when they're in use, the number of people in those spaces is smaller. And that's sort of been one of the core things that we've learned about utilization. You know, you say like, is good utilization 38% or 41% or 50% or 25%? And it feels sort of arbitrary and also kind of hard to really ground truth decisions. And so as we've thought about these concepts of efficiency, you know, where should you consolidate? Where do you want to spend time and dollars and investment? And where is their critical mass? These two things have helped us navigate space. So I'm going to maybe turn it back over to Emre and let him kind of wander you through this interface. It's super snappy. It's really fun to play with. And all of the data that you're looking at is actual data about actual spaces of a certain size. So this is not procedurally generated. Okay, go ahead, Emre.
Cool. And what's cool is some of the people that have helped us to shape this are actually on this webinar live now, which is really awesome. So you'll see kind of what you've helped craft. And so starting here, we're looking at the month of October and the percentage of time that people are spending in each of these spaces during working hours, as Andrew mentioned. And so this is a good place to start to quantify and understand like how successful is return to office actually. And very quickly, we can see a trend on this kind of calendar interface on the left here that the office is more active Tuesdays through Thursdays. And depending on the type of company, you may actually just care about those 3 days. So we'll filter them out to get a better picture of what is actually happening Tuesdays through Thursdays at this office. And we have a mix of spaces. So on the left side, kind of on the outer sides of the office, we have a set of meeting rooms of various kind of sizes. In the middle here are our desk neighborhoods, and you can actually label these within density. And so we can see that engineering is sitting here versus product, marketing, and sales. And then we have a mix of different space types designed for these teams to collaborate and then also do focus work or take video calls. So we can see these kind of video conferencing Zoom rooms. And then different areas like these soft seating lounge areas. So this is kind of a typical mix of space types that we see across the customers and companies that we work with. And so what we want to understand is what's working well, like where are people spending time? And very quickly, we can see just looking at the meeting rooms that there's a mix of like the percentage of hours in the month of October that these spaces are used. And so like down here, these two spaces, they're used 65% of working hours, which is great. It's very different than this meeting room, which is only used 11% of working hours. And so we can start to kind of think about, okay, there might be too many meeting rooms on this floor, given the number of people that are coming in. And the
could I add something just because you're covering a whole bunch of interesting things. So something that we've noticed is that, and Kristen, you asked a question about if this tool is standalone or if it's an add-on to the platform. I'll talk about that live in a second. All of this, just in short, is all-encompassing. So if you use our systems of any kind, then you can use this system. So something that's really interesting that's come up in conversation is that like customers workplace teams and real estate teams want to make sure their employees and team members have access to the spaces that they require during the day. And so actually having low use or availability of like, call it like 90% of rooms are in use, but 10% of rooms are available is actually a really good signal, because you don't want the failure case where all the rooms are completely taken and you can't make available space to a team that requires a particular space type. And so we've seen this actually over and over, is like, do we have the right space types is a question. Do we have the right amount of space is a different question. And we can sort of answer both those questions very quickly, sort of at the floor or building or sort of portfolio level.
Yeah, so that's an awesome call. Yeah, the kind of analogy that we've heard over and over is like going into a parking lot when there's a lot of spaces available versus if there's only one space and you spend a lot of time trying to find that one parking space. Our partners and customers think about space very similarly, specifically even for meeting rooms, because as you kind of consolidate your space, one of the top of mind questions is, will I actually be able to have a room to hold a meeting in or take a video conference call inside? And so continuing on with meeting rooms, we can see there's a distribution of the percentage of working hours where these spaces are in use. This is, like Andrew said, quite good in that there's a lot of green spaces that are used most of the working day. And so the next thing we want to look at is how efficient are these spaces when they're in use. And this looks at the square footage and the average number of people when a meeting room is being used and kind of plots what the density is like for each of these. And so what we can see is this room down here is used 65% of the day, which is great. And then the density is 45 square feet per person. So they're an average of 6 people. There's an average of 6 people in this room when it's in use relative to its capacity of 12. And so this is very cool. This room is performing incredibly well relative to how it was designed. You can see kind of the frequency of the number of people that we see in this room and how many times we see 5 people. But against a 273 square footage meeting room that's designed for 12 people, we're seeing an average of 6 people in the space, and occupancy, or the number of people in the room, goes all the way up, sometimes even exceeds 12, which could be a red flag in terms of the kind of fire code. But this room is being used really well. That's different than the room up here, where it's, again, a 260 square foot room, but there's only 2 people in there when it's used. So not only is it available, it's not used 90% of working hours, but the number of people in it when it's in use is very low. And so what we can start to glean from this metric you can see on this floor, there are a lot of large meeting rooms. This is a pattern we're seeing across a lot of our customers of meeting rooms are being used through most hours of the day, but oftentimes the number of people in meeting rooms is quite low, like 2 to 3 people versus 7, 8, 9, 10 people in a meeting room at any given time. So that's one thing to think about looking at this data is there the right mix of meeting rooms sizes for the usage that's going on this floor?
There is this core question of like, if and when we get folks back into the office, how do we keep them there? Or how do we make sure that they have what they need? And what you're looking at is like a very visual system. It allows you to navigate time and physical space. But it is amazing what happens when you change programming, when you modify programming. We're going to show you some of this in some of the outcomes. This is a very visual way to navigate the data. We're going to show you some of the outcomes around, how often are people using spaces that are designed to meet, be social, or collaborate. These are sort of like very different functions. Focus time is very different. So we're going to show you some of those outcomes. I think it's very easy for organizations right now to talk about the dollars and cents of consolidation as like broad strokes. And I would say it's pretty clear that you can have material impact on the behaviors of people by simply understanding and getting visibility on use. And I'm very biased on this. I want to be really clear. Like I'm biased towards that outcome, but we've worked with some customers who have noticed that their people will come into an office and they'll scatter to the 4 or 5 floors that are available to them. And they've shut down 2 of those floors, and then seeing the density of their team or the critical mass of their team grow in the remaining open floors, which is exactly the behaviors they were trying to it not only reduced the overhead and operating costs of those floors, whether it's energy use or staffing or cleaning, it also improved the employee's experience because they're now much closer and it feels like there's material energy inside the space. There is a way to both be efficient and make better spaces. In fact, I think that the efficiency constraint that sort of the present economic conditions have created are resulting in better outcomes, or could result in better outcomes for customers that start to rethink what does the office actually mean and how do we instrument it.
Cool. So maybe that's a good point to segue into we're looking at data for a floor here and can kind of normalize it across the building, but what does it actually look like to roll this up and start to understand trends of what's going on in a portfolio?
Before we move on, actually, if you don't mind pulling that back up, we had a question around limits on various color schemes. So this is a good question. The question is, does the user set limits on the various color schemes, or are they set based on your research industry standards? These are relative based on sort of the performance of time used. So all the spaces have relative colors, and the middle is yellow. So the sort of middle of all of these different spaces is yellow. One of the things that we're thinking through, this tool is something that we iterate on pretty regularly for the customers who are on this call who have worked with us in the last handful of weeks. Will know it changes pretty quickly. And so one of the things that we've been thinking through is should there be targets around density? You may have a large space that's intended to be a lot of square feet per person. Those targets very much. Sorry, I'm in San Francisco, so I have a bit of noise in the background. Should there be targets for different spaces or space types? And if so, a space may not be red. It may actually be achieving its purpose. So that's one of the things we're thinking through. And then the other thing is that the concept of showing how your space is performing relative to others in the network is very much at the core of Atlas. You should be able to see how space is performing relative to other spaces in your portfolio or buildings. But more broadly, like, how is this performing relative to the industry? And we've noticed some really interesting circumstances where, one group is just totally killing it in terms of time used and density. They have their own goals of what they're trying to achieve locally in their network. But when compared to the broader industry, their policies are working. And that is a corporation that does not have a return to office mandate. In fact, we see the opposite. Folks with return to office mandates, we've seen data prove out that people don't come back, and it's much more sparsely used space. Before we move on, I want to call out a couple sort of like fun features that are just really great. Number one, if you could turn on September, thank you. You know where I'm going with this. You'll notice before you click it, maybe click week 2. So one of the common things that we get from customers is like, hey, I have holidays, you have holidays, we have federal holidays. Can you please just turn off that data so that it doesn't corrupt my information? So if you could just turn off Labor Day for me, you'll see the colors change slightly. We've now sort of eliminated that from the filter, which is really useful because if you go up to the top right and you click CSV, you can download all of the data that you've essentially selected. And it seems like a simple mechanic. You can stay here for one more second and we'll do cost per square foot. It seems like a simple mechanic, but that is actually a really fast way of being able to identify where there's interesting stuff, then be able to sort of pull that data out without having to navigate the same data in Google Sheets or Excel. And you don't have to corrupt the data with holidays or weekends or Mondays or Fridays or whatever it is that you're not interested in. Another fun little feature is the bottom left, which you'll see it says showing density for all spaces during working hours, Monday through Friday, 8 to 6 p.m. for the week of September 4th to September 10th. I'm probably burning too much time. We should move on because we're almost at 30 minutes. Can you just click and close workspace for me real quick?
Yep.
In the space types. So you'll see that the console in the bottom left changes. And then the last piece is that we want to provide tools that make it easy for you to report on performance. And so you'll see the cost per square foot here in the right sort of like panel. That's designed to sort of summarize the cost of your space. This will become editable so that you can modify it based on the region or location. But we otherwise have like a database of cost per square foot averages based on your address that we can apply so that you can start to visualize the value of spaces that are being used, floors that are maybe less used, and you can use that to report into your teams. So maybe we can. I think
just on that cost per square foot one of the points of feedback we got from one of our customers we work really closely with is that adding a dollars per square foot into this creates like a common language inside of a company for even, workplace teams and finance teams and many different types of teams to understand how much are we investing in a certain space type versus how it's intended to be used versus how it's actually being used. And so that's relevant for something like this theater event space here, where, it costs, if we project annually the cost per square foot here, it costs $70,000 a year per square foot, or I guess this space overall, the square feet for 1,000 square feet costs $70,000 a year. And so the question is that actually worth it given how the space is being used? And so trying to create a more accessible language than utilization, to Andrew's point at the beginning.
All right, let's jump into deck, because I think these end conclusions will be of use to the folks that are listening. So essentially, while Emre's pulling that up, it's cool that you can navigate data. Like, the tool is sort of fun, floor plans are great, yada, yada, but like, how does this roll up into actual decision making? And so Emre, if you want to kind of roll through this, I know we have about 6 minutes before some folks are going to have a hard stop. We can keep going past that, but see what ground you can cover.
Cool. So the question is, like, once we've established this language, how do we roll up this data and understand trends and like take action on it? And so this is an example of how we break this data down. It's a sample study that we did across 2 different buildings. And very quickly, we can see just by looking at the average time used across all spaces in these buildings, it's much higher in Chicago than in Seattle. And so that's an interesting trend of clearly, like, the percentage of time used in Chicago is double that of Seattle. The way you would action on this is by actually consolidating or hibernating spaces in Seattle to drive better usage. And in Chicago, there's a question of whether 23% is actually where we want it to be. We probably would want it to go up. And so there's room in Chicago as well. And I'll kind of click through some of the different ways we roll this data up that have resonated with our customers. One of the questions that folks have is, for these different space types, how are they used throughout hours of the day? And so here we're looking at workstations across every day of the week. And you can really quickly glean that people are using desks Tuesdays through Thursdays more, and more frequently after 1 p.m. And so this goes to the idea of critical mass versus availability, like how many desks are available at any given hour of the day. And the most usage we're seeing is 30% in this particular study. And so there's a lot of room to actually increase the number of people on a given floor from a desk's perspective. We then looked at, okay, like, what are the different types of desk configurations that resonate? And this is really interesting from a employee experience perspective, like testing different configurations. And so in this example, this wheel configuration is far outperforming the more traditional banks of desks. And I was actually talking about this with an architecture firm this morning. And one of the interesting discussions we were having is this wheel configuration is much more popular. But it takes more square footage per person to actually enable this type of configuration. You can see on the right, you can pack way more desks into this area in this configuration than if you had this wheel. And so an interesting question is, does the usage of the wheel, or kind of how efficient that space is, or how popular it is, justify taking these more traditional desks and replacing them with fewer desks of this wheel configuration?
There's also a theory that that this is because of privacy, that people appreciate, and we can talk about the history of the cubicle, but the wheel seems to be more effective, potentially because you're not side by side, screen to screen. We're not quite sure yet, but these get to be some of the behavioral questions that teams get to ask and then try to answer. And I want to clarify, like, it's very helpful to then also get anecdotal data from people that are on site. Like, why are you choosing this is a really good question. So the data kind of leads you to a thing, but then you get to kind of dig into the specifics of the anecdote.
Yeah. And I think when we looked at these desks, like, the whole team was very surprised that this was the case, actually, which was cool. So then given how big the difference is. We also looked at, this is a common one depending on the city of the building that we're measuring, but like how does the location of a desk affect usage? And found in this particular set of spaces that desks that had a view were much more popular than desks without. And so we'll talk about meeting rooms and kind of areas for collaboration in a second, but meeting rooms were more popular at this office than desk spaces. And so because people are spending time taking video calls with where there's one person in a 2 or 3 person room. And so these desk neighborhoods where they're less popular and don't have a view are a perfect place to kind of replace with orange rooms or phone booths for people to take video conferencing calls.
One thing that there was a question that came up is this report an output of the software, or did a user create this report? So our customer didn't create this report. We created this. We found that being able to, so essentially you do CSV download and then we can sort of turn this into this type of reporting. Some of this reporting will make its way into software. Other portions of this reporting can be unique to a customer. We just want to make it really easy for you to generate this kind of stuff so that you can present internally to your own teams the performance of things. Emre, if you wouldn't mind maybe flashing through a few more slides. We've only got another minute or two before we'll see some folks drop off.
Cool. Yeah, so meeting rooms similarly to desks. This is one of the things we're studying as folks consolidate and drive people to critical mass is, are there enough meeting rooms available at each hour of the day? So this has been a very popular chart for us to look at of what percentage of meeting rooms are available at any given time. We would expect these numbers, if we were approaching critical mass, to be much higher. So right now the max is 60% of on average, 60% of meeting rooms are being used. We would want it to be closer to 85%, so that at every hour of the day there's availability, and all these rooms are being used efficiently. This is a different look at the same data. So this looks at the percentage of time on average that meeting rooms are being used during working hours against how efficient they are. So how many people are there relative to the design of the space. And so what great looks like in this case is that meeting rooms are used most of the day, so during most of the working hours. And when they're in use, the number of people in the room is close to what the room was designed for. And what we can see here is there are a lot of rooms that are used, for most of the day. But when they are in use, they're very inefficient. And so those are these rooms on the left side where there's too few people in the room relative to its square footage. And then there's a set of rooms that are more efficient when they're in use. They're used by, if it's a 3 or 4 person room, by 2 to 3 people, which is really good, but they're not used during most of the working hours. And so this is
the reason. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, and the reason that this is important for workplace and real estate teams is because it gives you empirical data to inform strategic decisions about what you invest in or what you divest yourself of. Arming the teams with really great, clear data about use fundamentally changes the outcomes of what you invest in and what you don't. And so I would say we're, again, like this is sort of stuff that we enjoy and we talk about every day, but it's really exciting to see some of this data post-pandemic and really start to understand the fundamentals of why this is happening and how to invest in the stuff that is the behaviors that people are excited about.
Yeah, and we don't have this here, but doing a before and after of there's a significant change made in the portfolio, and we look at the 2 weeks before and the 2 weeks after has been super fascinating. Like when you decide to shut off 2 floors in a 5-story building, how does that affect the efficiency of the meeting rooms and the percentage of working hours that they're full? And that is so interesting to look at.
And users should expect to be able to quantify the financial impact and the qualitative impact on employee experience. And so some of the stuff that we're not showing here, but we're thinking through is, the more you sort of provide context about a space, if if you know your cleaning costs and you clean twice a day and it costs you 4 to 7 cents a square foot to clean, that's something that should just be quantitatively, it should just be calculated for you. You turn off a couple floors, it should tell you exactly kind of what happened, so that you have both the behavioral outcomes and the financial outcomes. Let's keep rolling.
Cool. So similar kind of concept, I think, here of collaboration space and how much time are people spending at different hours of the day. These are like the 4 types of spaces we're seeing people study are like desks, meeting rooms, collaboration, and social. And so you can see for each of these, there's a different actual behavior pattern for over the same amount of time for the same spaces, in the same buildings. There's different behavior patterns across these 4. And so what this then ties to is how do you actually adjust the mix of your spaces relative to how they're being used? What we found is the usage of collaboration spaces is very low, and desks relatively to meeting rooms is very low. And so for this, in this particular set of buildings, one of our recommendations was we should actually flip the ratio of the percentage of spaces dedicated to meeting rooms or to meetings where there's sound isolated and you can take a video call. You can also meet with 2 to 3 people, relative to collaboration spaces and desking. And so this is like one of the ways that you can action on this data is by thinking about, okay, how do we actually adjust the ratio against use now that there's a critical mass of people in the space? And so, like I said earlier, part of the actions here would be removing the desks that don't have a view, that are on the inside of the building, having fewer desks overall, investing in the wheel configuration, and then increasing the number of phone booths and 2 to 3 person meeting rooms that have video conferencing support to better serve the population that's in these buildings.
We're a little over the 30. If you have questions, we'll spend a few minutes answering them. But I guess what I would say is, if you wouldn't mind flashing the application real quick. One thing that we didn't talk about is sort of the import of maybe select just a month of any kind. There's 2 things I wanted to call out that I'm particularly excited about, or we're particularly excited about. Number one is when you select enclosed workspaces, maybe let's do enclosed workspaces and meeting rooms. So what you're seeing is essentially filtering down of the data against those 2 space types. If you select one space, Emre, any one space, you'll see each space has a set of labels. You can see them down sort of beneath the cost there. Those labels in a build that's not yet live are also navigable. So you should, as a user, be able to select product and eng and have it just light up the neighborhood. It's actually kind of wild, like when you select, when it's, particularly when you've labeled spaces based on teams, you can essentially like select a team and then just see what their behaviors are inside the spaces that have been sort of assigned to them or allocated to them. There's a really good question, and I probably should have said this at the beginning. How are we collecting this data? All of this data comes from bespoke radar sensors that we deploy, that our customers deploy, and we use the data that comes off of those sensors to generate this type of data. It's anonymous at source. So if you're unfamiliar with density, these systems are anonymous at source. We don't know gender, age, or ethnicity, but we can be deployed and with reasonably high levels of precision understand all that heat mapping that we showed you. So no ambient sort of measurement of phones or anything else. But just to get back to the labeling, you should be able to select the teams, see how those teams perform, and I think there's this distinction around badge data to be able to determine visits of people. When you badge into a building or badge into a space, that's one thing. But where, like, are the spaces that were allocated to teams being used in the way that you were expecting, or are those folks going elsewhere inside of the portfolio? And so I think there different questions and they're related. You can determine visits from badge, but really understanding use, I think, is kind of ground truth. Good question around, so we have two sort of sensor products. One is called entry, the other is open area. One of the questions is, do entry and open area both feed into Atlas? And the short answer is both of those sensors data feed into Atlas. So all of, you should just essentially not have to worry about which devices you use. It really should be the outcomes of measurement. You sort of decide what floor and building you want to measure, and you get deployed certain types of hardware to get that data, certain types of spaces that you're interested in, and you should get hardware that measures those spaces precisely. I've been talking for a bit, but I'm really excited about one other feature. If you could go over to the calendar for a second. So the way this came about, can you go to time used and maybe just turn off the enclosed, go back to the floor level, so turn off the space types. Okay, yeah. And then, okay, cool. So then if you can select like August, then September, then October, you'll see there's a pretty clear, like people are coming back to this building, like this floor. And the reason that we decided, so date pickers suck. They just like suck. They're really bad. They're all like text-based. You have to like remember what context you've selected. And so the origin of this particular like way of navigating data through time or selecting time came from, can we build a better date picker? One that actually has some type of visual data, some type of like actual data about what's happening in the space, and that it's visual enough that you can quickly say, well, what's happening in week 3 of October? Like actually what is happening on week 3 of October? Select the Monday, or don't select the Monday, but maybe deselect Tuesday through Friday. This is a wonky way of selecting a single day. We'll have a better way in the future, I promise. Yeah, so like what happened on this Monday? I'm not entirely sure, but like you should be able to annotate this, you know? You should be able to say like, this day was a day off for us internally, and there's a reason why there's utilization is low. So really excited about kind of what's to come for this. This really should be a tool that you can use and play with. It should be forgiving and fast and, dare I say, fun. God forbid enterprise software is fun. So anyway, goal is to try to make this something that's like really kind of a forgiving space. And we're really excited about the calendar navigation because it just makes it a lot easier to understand where you are in time or when you are in time. There's a question, are we able to, sorry, go ahead, Emre.
No, I was going to touch on the same thing of, you touched on this idea of annotation of what happened on this day, like Monday the 10th or this week. So the question of, can we add in factors like meals served in office or certain events that take place? That's something we're thinking about, of how do you add context and time, not just context to a space of this particular thing happened on a given day of the week or a given week of the month where there was an offsite and we saw very, very high usage. And so adding that context or creating more ways to add context to this data is something that we're really, really focused on.
Yeah. There's a great question, and this is tied, maybe Emre is speaking to the question that was asked around, are we able to add factors like meals served in office, which could drive attendance, or certain events that take place in the office? This concept of annotating the data is something that we're like thinking about, and I would expect to start to show up at some point soon. I think some of the questions are like, what's the best way to get at that data? Is there programmatic stuff that's really useful? Maybe you already have some data that, whether it's badge or it's a like space assignment that you can sort of provide us programmatically, or just upload. It also just may be like text, like we serve meals on this floor and we don't on other floors. That should be helpful information when you're reporting into the rest of your teams on what is driving attendance. Turns out food is a great decision. So if you have the ability to pull the lever on like serving food, and you want people back in office, strongly recommend pulling that lever because it works. The question is, can you keep them? And that's like I don't know if we can solve that problem. I think we could tell you sort of notionally what's happening and how, but can you keep them there instead of them just showing up for lunch is a question we've had some customers actually ask. Like we see people show up at 11 and they disappear at 1. And then there's another question like, will this recording be available sort of in follow-up? And I believe the answer is yes to that question. There's a reason we are recording this, so we should be able to provide this afterward. Cool. I'm like super excited about lots of other things. I think Emre is too. I would say it's a really fun interface. It's fun to play with. It's fun to build. And all the data is real. And so I would say as you're thinking about what you're trying to do and what you're trying to understand, we really think there's kind of two big sort of classifications of spaces or space types in your portfolio that are going to be really relevant during this macro. There's like all the space you're not going to get rid of. Like that space you should measure. And then there's everything else that you're trying to figure out. And we sort of have this hunch that like there should be ways to understand and make better decisions about all that space, and ways to obviously make better decisions about the space you're going to keep. But it's a very strange time in real estate and workplace, and we're working to try to build tools that can be fundamentally useful to some of the decisions that you all are going through. So I appreciate you all making time. If you have any questions or you are sort of interested in kind of following up, you can just send us an email at atlas@density.io. I'm also always available over LinkedIn. But thanks for the time and attention, and we'll follow up with a recording.